Today we're out here again with the 2019 Acura RDX. We're taking a look at the RDX again because I had a number of questions from you about the A-Spec trim, which is what this video will be focusing on, as well as Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. So this will be a little bit different than normal and shorter, I promise, and definitely focused on the sport trim of Acura's new compact luxury crossover. The first and most important thing to know about the A-Spec trim of the RDX is that we don't get any extra power under the hood. Instead, this is more of a looks good, handles better package. So we get a tweaked front end look. Instead of the chrome surround here on the grille, we get this blacked out version, and we get a slightly different treatment to the bumper at the bottom. We still have full LED headlamps like we see in all RDX models for 2019. We also see a high level of standard equipment across the line in the RDX, and that is really one of the things that's defining this new model. The next thing you need to know is where the A-Spec lands in the lineup. This is not considered a top-end trim of the RDX. That is still the advanced package, which is what our last two videos on the RDX focused on primarily. That would get you the chrome surround up there and all of the options and features except for the wider tires and the sportier bits that we find on this particular model. At $43,500 for the front-wheel drive trim of the A-Spec, $45,500 for the all-wheel drive model, this is a little bit less expensive than that top-end trim, and the two packages are mutually exclusive. At the moment, you cannot get A-Spec with Advance. It's either A-Spec or Advance. Behind that large Acura logo up front, we have a radar sensor, and behind the windscreen, we have a camera. That's because all RDX models, A-Spec included, come standard with Acura's latest suite of all-encompassing active safety systems. We have dynamic radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, run-off-road mitigation, auto high beams, and a few other features in all models. The big thing here is that these features are all standard on the RDX. You don't have to choose an option package, and that actually is unusual for the luxury segment. Because while companies like Honda and Toyota have been aggressive at pushing these features onto mainstream models, in the luxury segment, we don't see that same push yet, except from Acura and from Lexus. Even safety-obsessed brands like Volvo don't include radar adaptive cruise control and all of the same goodies on every version of their vehicles. From the side, there are two ways you can tell that this is the A-Spec. We have an A-Spec badge here, that's pretty obvious. And then we have the wheels and the tires down here. These are 20-inch wheels and 255/45/20 tires. These are much wider than the standard tire that we find in the RDX, and just about as wide as the widest tire we see, for instance, on the Volvo XC60. These are also notably wider than the base tires we find on the BMW X3, and wider than the tires we would find on a BMW X3 that is comparably priced to the $45,500 all-wheel drive trim we're looking at here. Now, these are not summer tires, they are all-season tires. So if you were willing to swap out the tires aftermarket, you would get even better handling than what we see from the factory. It's also worth noting that there are no body modifications for the A-Spec, so we don't have wider fender flares or anything like that. That means that you could put 255/45/20s on an advanced trim and get better handling in that particular model. You could buy these wheels, for instance, from the dealer and stick them on any version of the RDX, although it might actually cost you more than just buying an A-Spec trim. Out back, things look very much like the rest of the RDX lineup, except for the A-Spec badge right here and a different treatment to the lower end of the bumper, including these two very large exhaust tips. As I said at the beginning of the video, we don't get any extra power under the hood. All RDX models use this same 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, which is a pretty big departure from the last generation, but actually very much like the first generation of the RDX. This engine produces 272 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, which is very healthy for a base engine. This is notably more than we find, for instance, in the Volvo XC60 T5 or the new Infiniti QX50. And all 280 pound-feet of torque are available at a fairly low 1600 RPM and hang out to about 4500 RPM. Helping get that power to the ground is an all-new 10-speed automatic transmission that bears no resemblance to the ZF9 speed that Acura has used in the past. It actually is more similar to what we see in the Honda Odyssey as well as the Honda Accord. The 10-speed automatic transmission has a very, very low first gear to help give you excellent off-the-line acceleration and a very tall final gear to help improve overall fuel economy. Of course, if you get the A-Spec trim, then we do get slightly lower fuel economy than the regular trims of the RDX, because of the wider tires we have on this model. You get 24 miles per gallon if you choose the front-wheel drive model, 23 if you choose the all-wheel drive model, but I have to say that in our testing so far, we've actually been getting about the same fuel economy as the regular RDX model. Now let's talk about the all-wheel drive system, because this has caused some confusion and a lot of debate over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, as well as here on YouTube. This vehicle receives Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, which is different than the all-wheel drive system we had in the second generation RDX, and very different than the all-wheel drive systems we find in the competitive set, like the Buick Envision, the Volvo, or the Infiniti. In order to truly understand super handling all-wheel drive, we need to talk a little bit about vehicle dynamics, and I realize that could get a little bit boring, but you guys asked for it, so let's dive in. This vehicle has a transverse engine under the hood and a transaxle. That means that the engine, the transmission, everything is right here under the hood. That's because it starts out as a front-wheel drive vehicle. As a result of having your engine and transmission in that arrangement, they are sitting either right on top of or just in front of the front axle. More of the vehicle's weight is on the front axle than on the rear axle. That's different than something like a BMW X3 or an Alfa Romeo Stelvio or a Mercedes-Benz GLC, because they're rear-wheel drive designed vehicles. So they have a longitudinal engine. The transmission ends up being somewhere around here in the vehicle between the driver's seat and the front passenger seat, and that makes the weight a little bit more evenly distributed in the vehicle. As a result of the overall design of the RDX, the Lexus NX, the Volvo XC60, the Infiniti QX50, etc., all of these vehicles carry more of their weight on the front axle than on the rear axle. Generally, it ends up being right around 60-40. Some manufacturers like Volvo have gone to extraordinary lengths to try and remove as much weight from the front axle as possible, so the XC60 in T5 and T6 form actually has a better weight balance than what we're seeing here in the RDX. It is a little bit closer to some of those rear-wheel drive vehicles, but it is still definitely heavier up front than in the back. Now we have to talk about super handling all-wheel drive. One of the things you can do to try and correct the front heavy weight bias of this vehicle and have it perform dynamically more like a rear-wheel drive vehicle is simply to send more power to the rear. And the reason for that is that just because a vehicle is heavy up front doesn't mean it has to handle poorly or be less fun. If you take a look at a number of American muscle cars, specifically things like Dodge Challengers or Dodge Chargers, they have a weight balance that is very much like a front-wheel drive vehicle because the engine is so large up front that it makes the front heavy. But they still have a rear power bias, so they're a lot of fun. That's exactly what Acura is doing with super handling all-wheel drive, because this all-wheel drive system can send up to 70% of engine power to the rear axle, even when there is no slip on the front axle. Now, this has caused some confusion in advertising. That does not mean that this vehicle cannot send 100% of engine power to the rear axle when the front axle is slipping. This vehicle can under certain circumstances, just like most all-wheel drive vehicles in America. It's the under certain circumstances part of this equation that you need to understand. You also have to understand how the power is getting from the front to the rear axle. In something like a BMW X3 or an Alfa Romeo Stelvio, or again that Mercedes-Benz GLC, the transmission is by default sending power to the rear axle, and if it wants to send more power to the rear axle, it just disconnects the front. Nothing's going up front, it's all going to the rear. In a vehicle that starts out as a front-wheel drive designed vehicle, like this, the Volvo, the Infiniti, etc., power is always going to be going to the front axle, and the vehicle can choose to send power to the rear axle or not send power to the rear axle. Rear-wheel drive vehicles operate in the reverse. They're going to be sending power by default to the rear axle, and they can choose to send power up front or not. If we're talking about fun-to-drive dynamics, for a rear-wheel drive vehicle, not being able to send more than 50% of power to the front unless there is wheel slip is not really much of a problem. However, in a front-wheel biased vehicle like this, people tend to prefer rear-wheel drive dynamics for more fun, so that was a problem. Acura solves this by making the rear axle spin faster than the front. Torque can only really be applied when there is resistance, because without resistance there is no torque. So by making the rear wheel spin a little bit faster, those are the tires that are getting more resistance than the front, and that has the effect of sending more torque to the rear axle. Up to 70% depending on exactly what's going on. Acura doesn't mean 70% of maximum engine output, they mean 70% of engine output at specific RPMs in specific situations. Then what Acura does is they include a torque vectoring rear axle that allows the vehicle to send that 70% of engine power to a single rear wheel. It allows this vehicle dynamically to have a strong rear power bias that would not be available in a vehicle without the overdrive unit and without that torque vectoring ability. So the Acura RDX, especially on a loose surface, can actually oversteer like a Ford Mustang or a Chevy Camaro. And then in neutral handling situations, it would return to driving like a vehicle that carried more of its weight up front. So in some ways, actually a little bit more like an American muscle car, if you want to think of it that way. The Buick Envision has part of this puzzle. It has a torque vectoring rear axle, but it lacks the overdrive unit. The Envision confuses a few people because it has the same torque vectoring rear axle that the Ford Focus RS does, but not the overdrive ability of the Ford Focus RS. In addition to that, it suffers from a little bit of marketing spin here. Because, like I said, this vehicle can send 100% of engine power to the rear axle, assuming the front wheels are slipping. If they're just spinning on ice, that power can go to the rear axle. So can the Buick Envision. But Acura doesn't market this the same way as the Buick does. They're going after that rear power bias, assuming no power slip. So that's the difference between these two vehicles. The Buick Envision, assuming no slip on the front axle, the maximum amount of power it can send to the rear axle is just over 50%, and that's due to the overall velocities of the different tires going on when you're going around a corner. It is theoretically possible to go just over 50, but not much over 50. And it can theoretically send that 50% to a single rear wheel to help it turn in a little bit better. But it's never going to feel quite like this. However, it is a step above the systems that we see, for instance, in the Volvo XC60 and the Infiniti QX50, which do not have a torque vectoring axle in the back. All models of the RDX get this large panoramic moonroof. And at this point, I would again remind you that the A-Spec is one of the upper end trims, but it is not the top end trim of the RDX. We do, however, have the up-level Panasonic ELS sound system with the speakers right there in the ceiling. We also have red leather upholstery, and it's a combination of leather and Alcantara inserts. Overall combined legroom is among the best in this category, so if you're looking for something with a lot of legroom, this is definitely going to be it. We have about 10 inches more combined legroom in here than we find in the Alfa Romeo Stelvio. The A-Spec gets perforated leather and perforated Alcantara because these seats are both heated and ventilated, and you can see that we have a slightly different seat design than we see in the regular Acura model. I find these seats very comfortable, but they are not quite as adjustable as the top-end trim because we do lose the inflatable side bolsters and the extending thigh cushion. I do think that's a little bit of a pity. Over on the doors, we have more of that red stitching, and you can see that ELS logo right there on the speaker. And then instead of wood trim or other trim, we actually have aluminum trim on the doors. All models of the RDX get Acura's latest infotainment system. This uses a touchpad, very much like we see in certain Lexus models, although the actual operation of the system is just a little bit different. If you want to know more about that, I do have a complete video review on that system on my channel. Again, that red stitching continues down here on the center console, and then we have an area with a roller cover there. The trim matches what we have on the doors, 2 large cup holders there. Again, more of that stitching over here on the center armrest. The instrument cluster gets a unique look versus the other RDX models, designed to be a little bit sportier with the red numbers that you can see right there. The instrument cluster gets a unique look versus the other RDX models with the red numbers that you can see on these dials, but we still don't have a full LCD instrument cluster. Instead, we have this partial LCD element right there in the middle for things like our trip computer readout and, of course, the status of the navigation and super handling all-wheel drive system. If you put the vehicle in sport mode, we get a turbo gauge as well as the lateral acceleration gauge. In addition to the tweaked gauges, A-Spec shoppers also get a slightly tweaked steering wheel. We have an aggressive sport grip up top, perforated sections right there on the side, contrasting stitching, and of course paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. You'll still find the infotainment controls over here on the left side of the wheel, radar adaptive cruise controls over here on the right, and then this knob controls that multifunction display. The important thing to remember about the A-Spec trim of the RDX is that this is a looks better, handles better package. So we have exactly the same amount of power under the hood. That means that 0 to 60 still happens in 5.7 seconds. It really is unaffected by the upgraded tires that we have on this model. 5.7 seconds is a little bit behind the base version of the Alfa Romeo Stelvio or a Volvo XC60 T6, but it is actually quite good for a base model in this segment. And remember that the Acura RDX doesn't really compete with top-end trims of the X3, the Q5, the Volvo, etc., because the price tag on this A-Spec model is considerably lower than some of those top-end sporty trims of the competition. Acura's brand new 10-speed automatic transmission has a very aggressive first gear, which really helps launch times, especially if you get the model with super handling all-wheel drive, because in the front-wheel drive trims, traction is a little bit of a problem. If your mind is really set on getting the two-wheel drive version of the RDX, traction does improve a little bit in the A-Spec front-wheel drive model because we still get the wider tires that we have on the trim that we're looking at right here. The wider tires help improve the braking score versus the advanced trim, which is what we last tested. This model went from 60 miles an hour back to zero in 111 feet, which is about 7 or 8 feet shorter than the rest of the RDX lineup. At casual glance, 7 or 8 feet difference doesn't really seem like an awful lot, but trust me, it actually is a pretty big difference. That's because the step up from a 235 width tire to a 255 width tire is actually a pretty big jump. The tire upgrade is the key to the reason that the A-Spec version handles much better than the regular version of the RDX or the top-end advanced trim. There are a lot of rumors out there that Acura is planning on putting a twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine under this hood soon, and the wider tires would indicate that that's definitely possible, because if Acura were to upgrade the power, they would definitely need a little bit more rubber out on the road. Now, the tires that Acura puts on the A-Spec are not the grippiest tires available, so you could actually further improve the braking and the handling ability of this vehicle by putting a very grippy summer tire on this car aftermarket. But it's also worth noting at this point that you could improve the handling of the advanced trim of the RDX by putting the same wheels and tires that this model has on it. When it comes to handling, it's important to understand the difference between power on handling and neutral handling. Neutral handling is when I'm going around corners like this and I don't have my foot on the gas pedal or on the brake pedal. Power on handling is logically when I'm going around a corner and I am applying throttle. In addition to sending more power to the rear axle than is possible with a traditional all-wheel drive system like the one that we would find on a Buick Envision or a Volvo XC60, the benefit to super handling all-wheel drive is that it can torque vector across the rear axle. But it can only do that when power is being applied to the vehicle. It's only going to do you any good really when power is being applied. So if I were to put this in, for instance, second gear, once we get slow enough I can do that, and I start going around this corner a little bit harder, the car is going to put more power to the outside rear wheel to help power you around the corner in a way that's going to feel more like a rear-wheel drive car. So more like something along the lines of a performance version of a GLC or a BMW X3. Now, unfortunately, because torque vectoring only works when you're applying power, when you're not applying power, weight balance is the bigger factor when it comes to overall handling feel. And the weight balance of this vehicle is substantially similar to the Volvo XC60 or the Infiniti QX50. And that is to say that it has more weight on the front axle than on the rear axle. It's not a near perfect balance like we find in the Stelvio or actually the BMW and the Mercedes product line. The best way I can think of to describe this is that if you're driving the RDX uphill, you're going to need to use the accelerator pedal, and you're actually going to get all the benefit of that torque vectoring around all those uphill corners. But if you were to do the same hill down, and especially if it was a steep hill and you're not really using any power to help you go down the hill, then the overall handling feel is going to be a little bit different, and you're going to be faster going uphill versus downhill. A lot of you have asked me about the Buick Envision and Buick's all-wheel drive system, because in some of the latest Buick models, they are employing a torque vectoring rear axle, and so they can send more power to one rear wheel than to the other. The difference between those systems and the Acura system is that those systems cannot send more than about 50% of engine power to the rear axle unless the front axle slips. Once the front axle slips, then they can send more power to the rear. Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system can also send more than 70% of the power to the rear axle, assuming the front axle is slipping. But the key difference here is that even when the front axle is not slipping, this vehicle can still send more power to the rear axle, up to about 70%, depending on the speed, the throttle position, etc. That's because this vehicle will actually overdrive the rear axle. It will make those wheels spin ever so slightly faster than the front wheels, and that's what really gives you the aggressive torque vectoring that we find in this model. It has a very, very different feel to it out, especially on a small track like an autocross track. When you're really powering hard on this vehicle, you can actually get a very rear-wheel drive oversteer dynamic that's just not possible in any of the other systems. Of course, that oversteer dynamic is definitely possible in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, even if they don't have a torque vectoring axle. When it comes to our overall ride score, I'm going to give this particular model a B. It is a little bit firmer than the regular versions of the RDX, and the advanced trim in its softest suspension mode is a little bit more compliant than this as well. I really wish that Acura would make an A-Spec advanced trim to give this model the adaptive suspension, because I think that would really add to the overall feeling of the A-Spec. It could be a little bit firmer than what we have here, but it could also make the suspension a little bit softer if you wanted a more comfortable driving experience on your way to work. In our cabin noise tests, we scored 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which is just a little bit louder than the last model that we tested, which was the top-end advanced trim. That's logical, of course, because we don't get the acoustic laminated side windows that we find in that top-end trim, and the exhaust tips are a little bit different in this model that may have some effect. The bigger effect is likely going to be the tires that we have on this model. They're 255 width tires yet again, and road noise is one of the areas where this is different. I think that wind noise is actually about the same, but we do get a little bit more noise coming up from the floorboards thanks to those wider tires. The tire compound is also a little bit different, so remember that if you put aftermarket tires on your RDX, especially if they're going to be grippy summer tires, it's likely going to be a little bit louder in the cabin. That's something that happens when you change tires on any vehicle. Although the EPA says that the fuel economy for the A-Spec should be about 1 mile per gallon lower than the regular model, in our typical driving test, we've actually been averaging right around the same, only about 0.2 of a gallon different. So I'm going to give this the same B- when it comes to overall fuel economy. 23 miles per gallon falls behind some of the efficient European entries, especially something like the hybrid Volvo XC60 and of course the hybrid Lexus NX. As you'd logically imagine, this is definitely more fun than the Lexus NX hybrid out on the road. But I would say this actually matches the Volvo XC60 T8 in terms of fun factor, but they're fun in different ways because this has a more dynamic handling feel to it than that Volvo. Remember that the T8 does not have a mechanical all-wheel drive system. It actually uses an electric axle in the rear. But the Volvo T8 hybrid system is very powerful. 400 horsepower, 475 pound-feet of torque. It is considerably faster than this RDX. Of course, the Volvo is also significantly more expensive. So when it comes to bang for the buck, it's pretty hard to argue with the RDX. As long as you get the super handling all-wheel drive system, I would say this is more fun than the vast majority of the European competition at the same price point. There are a few exceptions, of course. The base Alfa Romeo Stelvio I do think is more fun than this. It does come in a rear-wheel drive version for 2019, and that's a pretty big deal. Adding the A-Spec package to your RDX will definitely have a serious improvement on handling and braking ability. It doesn't really take too much of a toll on ride, fortunately, but I have to say that my personal preference would be to get some of these A-Spec parts and actually put them on the advanced trim of the RDX, because I really do like the extra features that we find on that model. The heads-up display, I think, is definitely an advantage if you're trying to drive the car hard out on the road. We also get that adaptive suspension, which I like. If you were hoping that A-Spec would give you better 0 to 60 numbers, then you will be a little bit disappointed. However, stay tuned because Acura might have something else up their sleeve later. And now down to the nitty-gritty. Would I buy the Acura RDX in A-Spec trim or advanced trim? Well, I think so far by the drive section I have made that clear. I think that if I were shopping for one, I'd buy the advanced trim, and then I would buy some of the A-Spec parts, and I would make my own A-Spec advanced. And I have to say that it would still be an incredible buy in the luxury small crossover segment if you went through all that trouble and expense, because this is significantly less expensive than so many of the competitors when you take a look at all the equipment that that model would get you, including the heads-up display, the more comfortable seats, theoretically the 255 width tires if you were to put them on that model. And you could likely still do that for about $2,000 more than the A-Spec trim if you really tried, keeping this still under $50,000. And if those features mean nothing to you and you're simply interested in the better handling performance that we have in the A-Spec trim, then I can definitely recommend it. Although again, I think I prefer the small amount of chrome that we find on that top-end model. This reminds me a little bit too much of the Honda Civic Type R, and I'm not a huge fan of the extra black bits. Perhaps if it was a color other than white, I would like it a bit more. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. On the other hand, I also have to say before we go that the Alfa Romeo Stelvio is now available in rear-wheel drive format. So if you're looking for the absolute in sporty, that Alfa Romeo is a very tasty option. And for the price of this, you could get a nicely equipped Stelvio as well. It's not likely going to be as reliable as the Acura, however, and that is an important thing to keep in mind. But if you're interested in leasing a vehicle, I would say look long and hard at that rear-wheel drive Stelvio if you want the absolute blast for your dollar. If you want a slightly safer bet, definitely look at the RDX A-Spec. I'll see you next week.